you very much for the introduction. Yeah, I was lucky enough in my career as a park ranger in my own backyard in San Francisco for many years to start my career on Alcatraz. It was open to the public for the first time as a historic site in 1973. And when I started out there as a temporary park ranger, a year later, the prison had only been closed for 11 years. So we were in the sweet spot of being able to interview dozens and dozens of former prisoners, former guards, uh, now grown children who grew up on Alcatraz. And I followed the history of Alcatraz back in time to the Civil War and even to the gold rush. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Um, I hope my talk is going to generate a bunch of questions. And if you could put those in the chat room, Catherine and I will answer them at the very end of the program. So I'm going to endeavor now to quickly go over to share screen and start the program. 250 years on the rock. The name of Alcatraz, that basically covers the whole time span of recorded history. Recorded history is not to deny the native peoples who lived in the Bay Area, but apparently Alcatraz's history starts when the first colonial Spaniards arrived. We can find no history of Alcatraz pre-contact, which is kind of fascinating, but maybe we can understand why as we go through. This is how we see Alcatraz today. This is how 1.7 million visitors annually see Alcatraz. The rock, dominated by the huge penitentiary structure, convict built at the turn of the century. Inside, the cell blocks, Broadway, the island that became famous partly because of its notorious reputation and also because of, to be frank, Hollywood. We'll discuss that at the very end. The island was, contrary to many people's belief, it was not a hellhole. It was not a terrible place to do time, but it was a very hard place to do time. But island has so much more history than just being a penitentiary. Let's go back to the first arrival of colonial Europeans who would be the Spanish explorers. Out here in California, we have a very short history. Spain didn't even know San Francisco Bay existed until 1769, and it took them 6 more years to get a ship sail up the California coast and actually enter San Francisco Bay. That ship is called the San Carlos. When it entered San Francisco Bay, it was literally entering a terra incognita, an unknown land. There were no charts, there were no maps. So one of the first things they did was they created a chart of San Francisco Bay. It's maybe kind of unrecognizable to us today. It's almost cartoon-like. This was the first attempt. What I draw your attention to is at lower right, it says Y D Alcatraze. What does that mean? It's Spanish shorthand for Isla de los Alcatraces, island of pelicans. That's the most common translation. And if you look, the bay, it's full of little tiny rocks of various sizes. Some of them have names, some of them don't. Alcatraz, in the location where it's shown here, that name's going to move. In 1826, a British map maker came in, and he made a much better map of San Francisco Bay. And all of a sudden, what had been called Alcatraz is now called Yerba Buena Island. For reasons unknown, Captain Beechey of the Royal Navy moved the names around. He took Alcatraces, Pelican Island, and it appears up here. It had previously been just another one of the many rocks in San Francisco Bay. And that about summarizes what it was. This is the earliest photo we've ever seen of Alcatraz. It was taken, we believe, in 1853 before any construction began. It looked, one person looked at this, said it looks like a whale asleep in the bay, a big humpback. There was no natural vegetation. There was no water. The rock was terrible quality. It was a friable sandstone, so you couldn't quarry or tunnel into it. Uh, this may be why the Native Americans had no use for Alcatraz as a barren, treeless rock. There are much better places to live around San Francisco. They probably stopped and hunted eggs on the island because, as I mentioned, that the name Alcatraz, Pelican Island, well, it was known, and even this photo documents it. It was covered with white guano from thousands and thousands of birds, pelicans, uh, cormorants, especially western seagulls that nested on the island. An early Yankee nickname for Alcatraz, in fact, was Bird Island or White Island, or I'll sanitize it a bit, Bird Guano Island. And it said you could smell it before you could even see it through the fog. Alcatraz had no occupation by the Native Americans, none by the Spaniards, who were the first colonists in San Francisco, none by the Mexicans. The Mexican government took over control of California in 1822 when they got their independence. And when the Americans conquered California in 1846, they had no use for the island, except it was charted on maps prominently because sitting in the middle of the bay, it was a real hazard to navigation. What happened 2 years later, 1848, gold is discovered on the American River near Sacramento. And Gold Rush San Francisco was, it was just unheard of in human history. The movement of people and material that happened when gold was discovered. Historians calculate that there were about 850 people living in the little village that called itself San Francisco when gold was discovered. A year and a half later, there were 25,000 people. The ships, hundreds of them, as shown in this photograph from 1853, they were chartered by people from around the world, a lot from the East Coast, many from Europe, some from as far away as Asia, to get to California to hunt for gold. And then the ships were promptly abandoned in the harbor. Pretty soon, San Francisco, it's not only full of ships, not only full of people, but it's also starting to be the site of government installations that needed to be protected. The first thing that you might think of is a mint, where gold flakes and nuggets were turned into actual coins, give some stability to the economy. There were Navy yards that were built on San Francisco Bay. There were civilian repair facilities. There were all kinds of industries. There were banking houses. There was an arsenal up the Sacramento River at Benicia. And we were a long ways from nowhere. Pre-Transcontinental Railroad, pre-Panama Canal, pre-telegraph. The fastest communication with the East Coast would be via ship down to the Isthmus of Panama and then walking across the isthmus on foot and then catching a ride on the other side, another ship, 6 weeks each way. If you wanted to get freight to California, or if you wanted to send, say, a cargo of gold out of San Francisco to the East Coast, it might take 6 months. You had to go all the way around Cape Horn. So we needed protection. We needed protection in a couple of ways. First off, all these ships coming in, they had a nasty habit of plowing up on the rocks at the entrance to San Francisco Bay, which had recently become known as the Golden Gate. So this is where Alcatraz's first use came in. In 1854, the first lighthouse on the West Coast was established on Alcatraz Island. It worked for two things. First, it marked the location of the island, which was a hazard to navigation, sit and squat in the middle of the bay. Ships could easily run into it. The light kept them away. Also, too, the light could be seen at such a far distance, it could be seen way out at sea outside the harbor entrance, and ships could zero in on the light as they entered San Francisco Bay. And as long as they kept the light clearly in view, it meant they weren't on the rocks, they weren't behind the cliffs. It was for safe passage. Simultaneously with establishing a lighthouse, the US Army was converting Alcatraz into a massive fortress in the middle of San Francisco Bay. We were very much afraid that other European powers, anybody that had a navy, to be frank, could easily have taken over California at the start of the gold rush. There just weren't any defenses out here. So very quickly, the US Army planned and began building ports around San Francisco Bay in fear of, to give them a name, the most likely enemy we feared was the British, the Royal Navy. We were not on good terms with Britain at this time, and Britain even had a kind of a shaky claim, but a real one, to San Francisco in California, based on a visit by Francis Drake in 1579. So to make sure that the British or the French or the Russians or anybody with a fleet didn't take San Francisco, Alcatraz was turned into basically a Rock of Gibraltar on the west coast of the United States. It was ringed with cannon, sitting where it does in the middle of the bay. Any ships entering the harbor had to first sail directly towards Alcatraz, and then they had to go around it to the left or to the right to enter the rest of the harbor. So island was pretty much ringed with cannon facing the direction where the ships would enter and then pass. And if an enemy ship ever did try to enter the harbor and get past Alcatraz, guns on the backside of the island faced towards where the anchorages were, near Telegraph Hill, and that what they called a sea of masts that I showed you in the earlier photograph. It was a huge construction job to turn the island into what essentially became a fortified rock. If you've ever traveled in Europe, I saw examples of fortified hill towns in Spain, where a prominent hill would be converted into a fortress with a civilian community surrounded by high walls. And at the very top of the fortified hill, there'd either be a castle or sometimes a cathedral, sometimes both. Alcatraz bore very similar semblance. You can see the surrounding walls. You can see that at the very top, there's a building. It was called the Citadel. We had an artist commissioned to create a bird's eye view of what the island looked like. By 1861, at the start of the American Civil War, this was Alcatraz. As you can see, there's about a half mile of cannons sitting behind high parapet walls. The actual slopes of the island, the sheer cliffs, were considered to be such a deterrent that any enemy trying to land would be forced to scale these cliffs, almost like medieval warfare. And I should say, no one ever tried. Although we were built with an eye to that might be the British or European foe, during the American Civil War, the fear was that the Confederates would try to take over San Francisco Bay, that they would either do it by maybe working with the British to attack by sea, or that they might come by land. Alcatraz had at one point had amazing, it had 400 soldiers living on it. It had 111 cannon. There was food and water, cisterns that had been dug into the rock, ammunition magazines. 400 guys could have held out for 6 months. Why would they hold out for 6 months? Because as long as Alcatraz held out and those guns were manned, no other ship could enter San Francisco Bay. Even if San Francisco was captured by land, you couldn't get shipping in or out. So Alcatraz was the key to the defense of the West Coast. And the amounts of gold and later the amounts of silver coming out of the Comstock lode in Nevada, San Francisco was a very rich prize. Even though we were never attacked, the fear was always there throughout the Civil War. And they kept upgrading the armament on the island to times that reached near ridiculous sizes. These were called 15-inch caliber Rodman guns, named after their developer, Thomas Rodman. But you can see that in the foreground, it took 4 guys just to lift the 15-inch diameter cannonball. The gun could only be fired once every several minutes, but it had a range of 3 miles, a 440-pound cannonball. One of those would, if it hit, would just basically destroy any floating target that was known with they said was the meteoric impact of the cannonball. You had soldiers living on the island. You also had, of course, the lighthouse keepers, and you had the families of the officer class who were living on the island. That big building in the background was called the Citadel. That's where the officers lived. Many of them had wives and children, and it was a fort in its own right. I'll talk about it just briefly because part of it is still there below the prison. I'll show you some pictures towards the end. It was a 3-story brick building. The walls were several feet thick. They had their own water supply. And if, to use a simile, if the island was ever attacked, and if an enemy ever got onto the island, this was the Alamo. This is where you're going to make your last stand. It didn't have real windows, it just had rifle slits. It'd be defended to the last man. The island by the late 1860s, it was becoming sort of notorious in the West. It was mysterious because the public wasn't allowed out there. A few photographs, like the ones I showed you, had gotten out, but it was not open to the general public by any means. And it also was developing a reputation, aside from being a fort, of being something much grimmer. It was a military prison. To explain, every army post has what's called a guardhouse, a prison, sometimes called a brig, where the soldiers are rather, a brig would be in the Navy. In the Army, it was the stockade, the guardhouse. This is for soldiers that break military law. And soldiers, young guys, they get into trouble. And it might be something minor. It might be something like getting drunk while you were on leave. It might be something more serious, like getting in a fight. It might be really serious, like desertion. So Alcatraz had a building called the guardhouse, where prisoners from that 400-man garrison, where they might be locked up for a week, 2 weeks, a month, depends how long their sentence was. Sometimes they were sentenced to serve time in the guardhouse, and when they were let out, they were made to carry a 24-pound ball, like in the photo. This wasn't Bugs Bunny stuff. This was real punishment. And what happened was Alcatraz was such a secure guardhouse, no one was escaping from it. And other army posts around the country, sometimes in cases far away as like the Oregon Territory and Arizona Territory, Alaska, if they had a hardcore military convict, maybe someone who was violent, repeat escape, and they would send them to Alcatraz to serve their sentences. So Alcatraz, the records show that the very first day that it had a garrison of regular troops was December 30, 1859. 11 men were already in confinement in that guardhouse. It doesn't record what they did. Most common thing that would get you in the guardhouse for an extended period was desertion. What did they have them do on the island? This amazing photograph taken in 1869 shows an army of convicts working on the side of one of the hills on Alcatraz. What they're doing is they're taking the island apart. They are trying to level the island in a never completed army effort to take Alcatraz from being a peaked island to being just a flat plateau. Under a magnifying glass in the background, you can see the hill is swarming with guys with picks and shovels. And you can see at the left, there's a line of guys with wheelbarrows running up a plank, and they're dumping the broken rock over the walls. It would take them 7 years of effort working at this. How do we know they're prisoners? Well, because first off, there's an armed sentry in the center keeping a watch over all the guys. And secondly, we have reports that survive from that time period noting what convict work parties were working on what part of the island. And in 1869, they were leveling the hill behind what was called North Battery. This is what they were trying to do. This is a profile of the island taken just about the time of that photograph. They were just beginning to work at leveling it. The Army's idea was to terrace the island into two huge plateaus so you could mount more cannon on them. Again, continually upgrading the fortifications. Now, this is how Alcatraz would have looked. They didn't do it. This is how it ended up looking. But you can see that, boy, they made some headway. Look at that. There's a sheer 70-foot cliff of solid rock. That's where right below the flagpole, that's where the workers stopped. Why did they stop? Congress just changed its mind. In 1876, they said, no more fort construction. We're tired of funding, never-ending fortifications. So Alcatraz stayed in this shape. The fortifications were gradually buried, and eventually prison buildings were built on top of it. This is the original prison from the 1860s. It was on the backside of the island. It was not state of the art by any means. It sort of grew haphazardly. The inside of the cell blocks were actually made of wood. The heavy planks with several layers of planks with the grain going in different directions were put together. The doors were strap iron. Looks like something out of the Old West. The cells in one report, they measured 3 feet by 6 feet by 9 feet tall. So if you're 6'3", you're going to have a hard time in that cell. The men mostly stayed in the cells at night. They were let out during the day if they weren't doing demolition or breaking rock or excavating Alcatraz. They'd ship them by boat to other army posts around the bay where they did scut work like cutting wood or building roads. And these guys were, one historian described them as they were the dregs of the U.S. Army. The guard at center, he's dividing the men for the noon count. You notice on the left that the guys, they had the big letter P on their hat and on the back of their jackets. That was so if they're on a work party and they made a run for it, immediately that they're a prisoner, they're on the run. And the reason that they're all squeezed against the wall, humiliation, that's all. The soldiers, they didn't wear stripes. They wore old uniform items that had been stripped of any brass work or rank or insignia. And sometimes it was dyed a sort of a dull gray-black color. And that was the Alcatraz of the turn of the century. Sometimes, quote, special prisoners were sent to Alcatraz, Native Americans who fought against the U.S. Army. Remember, this is the time of the so-called Indian Wars, made famous by the John Ford movies. It was a horrific time to be on either side, to be a Native American who was being forced onto reservations, or to be a cavalryman or an infantryman fighting against the Native Americans. These particular guys, these were 19 Hopi who came from Arizona. They weren't warring against the United States. They were just resisting. And what were they resisting? Having their kids taken away and put in reservation schools. You may have followed that some stories are coming to light now of what happened when Indian children were taken away from their parents. They were sent to reservation schools. Basically, they were tried to turn them into non-Indians. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They had to cut their hair. They had to learn English. These 19 men they were fathers who were resisting having that happen to their kids. And for their conscientious resistance, they were sent to Alcatraz. They weren't on the island long, and they actually were something of a, I don't want to say curiosity, but there was fascination with the people in San Francisco about these guys. They'd read about them, they were on the island, and they were given tours of San Francisco by the military. Especially, they would take them to grammar schools so they could see how the school systems worked. Basically, they're trying to co-opt them. Um, Ireland had three distinct personalities. One was the fortifications, the other was the prison we just talked about, and the third was the residential areas. This was the officers' row. These were the high-ranking officers living in these so-called cottages lining the sheltered east side of the island. It wasn't bad duty, uh, especially being in San Francisco. San Francisco is the only place that had really any society, any type of entertainment, educational facilities in the West. Families that lived on the island, especially the officer class, they were part of the upper echelons of San Francisco society. So they were invited to balls, they attended the opera, they were written about in the newspapers. Downside, this was still the Wild West. When you were out here in the 1880s and 1890s, you were a long way from the more desirable posts that were going to be on the East Coast. At the turn of the 20th century, we have to say now, the Army was faced with a situation where the fortifications on Alcatraz, they were just woefully obsolete. The big cannon were gradually being taken away and scrapped. And the Army was faced with three alternatives for what to do with Alcatraz. One is totally rebuild the island yet again with modern fortifications. Two, abandon the island, maybe give it to the state of California. Or three, turn it into a full-time prison. During the Spanish-American War and the ensuing Philippine War, there were one time about 500 U.S. Army soldiers imprisoned on the island. They were coming from the Philippine Islands. They were coming from Hawaii and Guam. Any place west of the Rockies was the geographic area where prisoners were sent to do time on Alcatraz. And the decision was made, turn it into a full-time, this time state-of-the-art, reinforced concrete prison. And from 1908 to 1912, the convicts who were confined on the island were put to work building what was simply called the prison. And when it was finished, it was an immensely large structure, and it was meant to hold 600 men, this time in one-man cells made of reinforced concrete. There was a recreation yard attached. I have an interior view. And this was night and day. Instead of being confined in those narrow wooden cells where you either slept on the floor or on a cot, and you had what was euphemistically called a night vessel, these cells, you had bunks, there were flush toilets, and there were sinks in every cell. There were electric lights, there was steam heat, and it still continued to be that the men were mostly locked in their cells at night, and during the day, they were taking out and they were doing hard labor. By the 1910s, the island was morphing. The whole idea of penology in the US Army was changing. And they euphemistically renamed the island Alcatraz Island Disciplinary Barracks rather than military prison. But it was still a prison. But the disciplinary barracks part meant that the soldiers, if they were in a class where they were considered to be savable, they were re-educated, went through military training again, went through classroom training. And if at the end of their sentence they had kept a clean record, they could go back to their regiments in the Army. They weren't just drummed out. And that was the whole idea, rehabilitation. And they were remarkably successful. About 75% of the young guys who were sent to the disciplinary barracks returned, the phrase was, they returned to the colors. Through World War I and into the 1920s, the prison was going pretty full blast. The highest we've ever found was a little over 610 men were on the island in 1919, tail end of the draftee era from the First World War. But then in the 1920s and then in the Depression, the Army began to question whether they needed to have a disciplinary barracks in the West. There just weren't that many soldiers being sent to it. A lot of them were just being held in stockades in Hawaii or at their home posts. And the Army decided to close Alcatraz and to focus their disciplinary barracks at Leavenworth and at Fort Jay in New York Harbor. Alcatraz decided that time to close it down. And the people of San Francisco, especially the Visitors Bureau, they were just ecstatic. Alcatraz was just, it was an embarrassing stain on San Francisco Bay. I mean, one report said you had to explain to every visitor entering San Francisco by ship that giant island and the giant building directly ahead of them, that's where Uncle Sam locks up its own soldiers for punishment. With it gone, the island could maybe be redeveloped, but whatever, it wouldn't have the reputation of being the Rock. Well, that didn't last long. Within a few months of the Army announcing it was going to be leaving Alcatraz, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons announced that they were taking over the island from what was then called the War Department to turn it into a civilian penitentiary. And it was going to be a totally different class of prisoners than the young soldiers who were undergoing a retraining, who had been on Alcatraz since it was finished in 1912. Briefly, what had happened in the United States in the 1920s was just earth-shaking upheavals in technology, in society. You had prohibition come in. You had what were called the Roaring Twenties. A lot of it was a snapback from the horrors of World War I. There was a feeling of questioning authority, and gangsters began to appear, especially in urban areas, taking over wide swaths of urban areas, doing drug dealing. And what was the drug? Alcohol. Because under the Volstead Act and Prohibition, manufacture and sale of alcohol for profit, it was outlawed. And the gangs found out that people wanted to drink. So there you go. The Untouchables, the Bonnie and Clyde era. Although the Bonnie and Clyde types, they were a little different. They weren't urban. They were more rural. They were called the mobile mobsters. The Bonnie and Clydes, the Pretty Boy Floyd, Ma Barker and her hideous sons, they were mobile and that they used cars. They would hold up banks, sometimes have gunfire with local authorities. And if they could drive across a state line, they couldn't be pursued. That was the old law. Well, the government responded by upgrading a branch called the Federal Office of Investigation. They called it the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover. New authorities were granted, laws were passed by Congress. Bank robbery became a federal offense. Before that, it was a state offense. Crossing a state line, that's a federal offense now. Kidnapping became a federal offense. And the feds stepped up prosecuting these guys, going after the mobsters in the cities and going after the mobile mobsters on the roads. And they ended up in the existing federal penitentiary system, places like Atlanta and Lewisburg. Pretty soon you had overcrowding in those prisons. And these are some pretty tough cookies when they went inside. Just because they were now doing time at Leavenworth didn't mean they still didn't have mob connections, didn't mean they still weren't, so to say, disciplinary problems. There was one group that took the warden hostage at Leavenworth and blasted their way out the main gate. What do you do with people like this? It was decided that one central penitentiary was needed with the toughest security possible, where there weren't going to be any attempts at rehabilitation, where it was just going to be confinement. And what was the island that was chosen for that? Alcatraz. It was available. The War Department was going to vacate it. The Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons decided that we'll take it over and they'll turn it into America's first supermax. And starting in late 1933, and continuing into 34, the aging Army facility was transformed into what was then state of the art. And the guys that were coming, there was no crime that got you into Alcatraz. There was no single offense. Anybody that had entered into the federal prison system uh, could be a crime on an Indian reservation. It could be a crime that took part in a national park. It could be a crime like bank robbery or kidnapping. If you were in the federal prison system and you were in any ways problematic, escape artist, maintain your gang operations, sometimes if you were just too dang famous, you were chosen to be sent to Alcatraz. And this was, as one person said, if you got on the wrong side of the warden, if he had a bad breakfast, he could just say, we're going to send your tail out to Alcatraz. And the first guys that were sent to Alcatraz, they were actually U.S. Army disciplinary barrack soldiers whose sentences were so long and their crimes they're pretty hideous that they were handed over from the Army to the Bureau of Prisons. Numbers 1 through 32 were old Army prisoners. To make Alcatraz state of the art, they brought in technology that was unseen when the island had been an Army prison. Guard towers were established around the island, manned 24 hours a day. Searchlights, barbed wire. Surprisingly enough, they hadn't used barbed wire when it was an Army prison, but miles of it were strung around the perimeter of the island during the conversion to penitentiary. Metal detectors were brought in, gas dispersing with the gas bombs mounted in the ceiling. And most important, they brought in correctional officers from all the other penitentiaries, the most experienced, the ones who were most savvy, and ones who could used to be called verbal judo. They wanted guys like Captain Phil Bergen here, who had that command presence. They could walk into a room where a fight was in progress, and by their sheer presence, sometimes it would calm down. If that didn't work, you try to talk him down. If that didn't work, I knew Phil before he died. In his 80s, he was formidable, and he would physically solve the problem. They didn't want people that were going to use force immediately, but they wanted officers that had that ability should it come, because again, they were dealing with not the dregs of the Army. This time, these were the hardcores of the federal prison system. Now, if Alcatraz Penitentiary has a birthday, we generally use August 22nd, 1934. That was the day that a trainload of prisoners, the first ones from outside, arrived at Alcatraz. They came from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. August, it was a train, the two cars to the left on the barge, they have bars over the windows. That's where the 53 convicts were locked up, chained to their chairs inside. The last car, that was for the U.S. Marshals who were guarding them. There was such fear that this Alcatraz Express might be taken over or attacked by mobsters that the train went on a circuitous route. Every time it stopped, it was surrounded by local police. When it got to San Francisco, it was sidetracked to a town way in the northern part of the bay called Tiburon. And they unhooked the engine and they put the whole train on a barge and brought it to Alcatraz before they let the men out. Among other reasons, Al Capone was on that train. The warden, when everybody was safely ensconced in their cells, he sent a telegram to the head of the Bureau of Prisons in Washington, D.C., simply stated, 53 crates of furniture safely arrive Alcatraz. And this was the world. Every prisoner had a one-man cell. You had a book of rules and regulations on your cell bunk when you arrived. And it was, these are the rules of the institution. This is when you eat. This is when you shave. Rule number 5 was very simple to memorize. It said, you are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Everything else is a privilege. Privileges are earned by good behavior. So that was literal. When you arrived, food, clothing, shelter, you're in your cell 23 hours a day. You were taken out for 3 20-minute meals. You had prisoner uniform to wear. Initially, it was coveralls. Later on, it was like Navy denims. And you had medical attention. There was a doctor. Anything else is a privilege. This particular guy is on fairly good behavior because you can see he has books. They did have a library. He was out. There's also a inkwell. He was allowed to write letters. He has a calendar. These were privileges. Getting out of your cell, aside from meals, was a privilege. Going to the yard was a privilege. This is how Alcatraz worked. It was considered to be the exquisite torture of monotony. If you wanted to get out of your cell, if you wanted to get a job, and there were some jobs that were offered, if you wanted to read books, write letters, get a visitor, behave yourself. Go with the rules of the institution. And they'll start with something simple, like letting you get books. Maybe they'll give you a job, like sweeping the floor. That was what Capone did. He swept the cell house floor, working in the kitchen. And then you could work your way up to better jobs. Visitors, if you were on good behavior, you get a visitor, one family member or your lawyer for an hour once a month. This is not luxurious. This is just getting by. The whole idea of Alcatraz was get you to conform to the penitentiary system. If you don't, you're going to spend the rest of your sentence. Don't know how long that is, but you can spend the rest of your sentence on Alcatraz. One guy spent 23 years. If you follow the institution's rules, they'll transfer you back to the prison you came from. The average stay on Alcatraz was about 5 years. If you didn't go along with the program, there was further punishment than just taking away privileges. And that was a series of underground rooms left over from the old citadel. Remember that from the Civil War era? Well, they built the prison on top of what was left of the citadel, and the basement rooms had been converted into what the Army called dungeons, and what the Federal Bureau of Prisons called deep solitary. It meant total darkness, locked in a brick room. During the daylight hours upstairs, you would be chained to the bars in a standing position. You were allowed to lie on the floor at night. You ate a restricted diet, and you were in there for up to 19 days at a stretch. Only a couple of men ever went through the hole more than once. Prisoners on good behavior, recreation yard. This was your outside world. You weren't getting off the island. The rec yard or the stockade, baseball diamond, handball courts. Guys would play checkers. Sometimes they play dominoes endless. That's probably what the guys at the extreme right are doing. Standing on the stairs like the fellows are at right, you could see over the wall. You could see the ferry boats going by. You could watch the Golden Gate Bridge being constructed. Some guys never went to the top of the steps. They didn't want to see the outside world. It was too close. It wasn't tempting. It was cloying. One guy, when I interviewed him, we talked about the yard, and he said that the whole time he was on Alcatraz for 8 years, the only dirt he stood on was the baseball diamond. Otherwise, he was standing on concrete the entire time he was on Alcatraz. And the weather, San Francisco has notoriously cold, foggy summers. It has clear, cold winters. Almost never snows. But boy, on the island, I can verify this, the wind just whips. This is a good example of how the prisoners dressed. They've got those, sometimes they're called cabbie caps or newsboy caps. They're wearing old Navy pea coats, Navy denim pants. The officers, at least they've got long overcoats to keep them from the weather. You could go to the yard On Saturday afternoons, you could go to the yard after you were finished your work detail before you went in for chow. And again, this is where you socialized. Interestingly enough, it was not as dangerous an area as you would think. The men didn't form gangs like they do in prisons nowadays. They might have had a gang allegiance. Inside, they tended to form friendships, small circles, but it isn't like you had the Crips and the Bloods and the white skinheads going after each other. No, if you had, one convict told me, I love prison lingo. He said, if you had a beef with another con and you didn't gang up on him, you worked it out mano a mano in the rec yard until the guard stopped you. Prison chaplain. They had a Catholic chaplain that came over from the city. They had a Protestant chaplain in residence. And for many years, they offered counseling on the island. Again, a privilege. Being an altar boy, privilege. Jobs. These were menial jobs. In this case, they're making gloves. In some cases, prisoners, they refinished furniture. No license plates. That's like a state responsibility. These guys here would refinish furniture. They had a giant laundry. It was done for other government agencies. You earned a few cents an hour, and it was put into a savings account for you. Best job, everyone says the best job was being a gardener. Guys who were non-dangerous, non-threatening, who were probably getting close to being released, they're the ones that were given the good job. You're outside, you're playing with dirt. And they said one big thing was you could see the families members, you could see the wives and the children at a distance. But many of these guys, were married. They had families. There were no women prisoners. It reminded them of home, though, to be able to see families, even through the wire and at a great distance. Famous prisoners who were sent to Alcatraz. These are the guys that got the publicity. They actually tend to be the most mild-mannered guys once they're on the island. George Kelly, Machine Gun Kelly. His real name was George Kelly Barnes. He was in for kidnapping and bank robbery. And people who met him, they said he seemed more like a bank president than a bank robber. College educated, very mild-mannered, still a kidnapper. He was on Alcatraz for 14 years and went to Leavenworth. He died there in 1954. Robert Stroud was the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. He didn't have any birds on Alcatraz Island. He did do amazing bird research, and he wrote about them, and he raised birds when he was at Leavenworth, Kansas. He was sent to Alcatraz in 1942 because he was just too high profile. The Bureau of Prisons wanted him gone, and when he was on Alcatraz, no pets were allowed, so no birds on Alcatraz. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, he was sometimes called the Black Al Capone or the King of Harlem. He ran rackets, drugs, prostitution. He was de facto the leader of the African American convicts. And he's one of the guys that came through Alcatraz more than once. He came through Alcatraz 2 times. Several men just didn't get it. They'd be released back to another prison, and then they'd be sent to Alcatraz again for continuing to be problematic. That was Bumpy. And then the real Al Capone. If there was a poster child for Alcatraz, it was Al Capone. It's almost as if they built it for him. He was so notorious, and he was so deep into crime, but his hands were kept so far removed from the actual mechanisms that they couldn't get him for physically committing any crime except income tax evasion. And he was convicted of income tax evasion. He got 11 years. And he started at Atlanta, and he was transferred to Alcatraz. He was on that first train. On Alcatraz, he was very low key. He just wanted to do his time and get out. He had a reputation, though, among the other convicts. I mean, he was famous to them. And young guys would attack him, thinking that if they got a piece of the big guy, maybe they could make their reputation. He was stabbed at least once. He was in several fights. He mostly worked in the cell house and sweeping up the floors and in the laundry for a while. But his health was declining. Um, he had syphilis that was untreated, and it was affecting. He became emotionally and mentally unstable. So he was transferred out in 1939. Wasn't on the island even 6 years. Wasn't even 5 years, and he dies in 1947. He was only 48 years old. As mentioned, most men out of Alcatraz in about 5 years, although some came back. The island settled into a routine over the years. There were escape attempts. None were really successful. The guys would get away for a few hours, then they'd be captured, then returned. During the war years, convicts turned out to be remarkably patriotic. And they threw themselves into war work. In this case, these are buoys for holding up nets. The US Navy had nets strung across San Francisco Bay to keep submarines out. This particular guy, Charlie Bird, doing the welding, he was a talented welder. He was also probably the most dangerous man on the island, but he threw himself in. One guy used the fact that they were doing laundry, military laundry, to his benefit. This is not an Army soldier. This is John Giles, Alcatraz convict number 250. He worked on the dock, loading and unloading bales of military laundry, and he would periodically pilfer a piece of laundry, a jacket here, a tie there, and eventually he had a complete tech sergeant's uniform. And one day in July 1945, he ducked under the dock where he had squirreled away all the stolen clothes, put them on, put on the cap, and walked onto the Army boat along with the other soldiers and sailed off into the distance. And he successfully escaped for about 20 minutes till the boat arrived at Angel Island. It was called Fort McDowell, a big Army replacement center. And the MPs were waiting for him because the guards knew they were missing one prisoner and they saw the boat disappearing. So they called the MPs on Angel Island. He actually sued, saying that he had escaped from Alcatraz and had been unlawfully detained by the MPs. It was like, yeah, nice try, John. He earned I think he earned 5 more years on his sentence for that escape. The guards actually kind of admired his chutzpah. The island was divided into 3 sections. At the left, the industrial area, the big square buildings and the powerhouse tower. In the center, the prison with attached recreation yard. You can see the baseball diamond. And on the right, the plateau that had been carved by the Army convicts. That was the living quarters for the family. There were 4 apartment houses. There were cottages. There was a duplex for the captain of the guard. And there was a whole community on Alcatraz, maybe 70 to 80 families. By one estimate, there are about 75 kids and maybe 300 civilians, kids, wives, lighthouse keepers, all living on Alcatraz. By all accounts, it was a good life. A friend of mine grew up on Alcatraz. She's written several books, and people ask her at book signings, "Weren't you afraid?" And her response is great. She said, "Why be afraid? Everybody's dad was a cop, and you knew where all the bad guys were, and they were locked up." Children, they had clubs. They rode their bikes sort of in circles on the giant parade ground area. They could have their friends over from the city. They took the boat into school every day. Wives maintained flower gardens and victory gardens during World War II. Parties were held. It was like a small town. The only thing is that supposedly there was no alcohol allowed on Alcatraz. And that's one of those things where everyone goes, yeah, that was the rule. And then there was reality. These wonderful color photos came from a Look magazine article that was done about children on Alcatraz in the 1950s. These kids, they're all my age now or older, and even in their 70s and 80s, they keep in touch, and they call themselves the Alcatraz alumni. They're a tight-knit group. By the 1950s, word is spreading that the island is going to close any moment. Well, actually, it didn't close any moment. The island would stay in operation for a total of 29 years. It didn't close until 1963. Reason wasn't what everyone suspected. It was too expensive to operate, or getting too old. It was escapes. The supposedly escape-proof island had never truly been escape-proof. I did research into pre-penitentiary newspapers, and there's dozens of articles about attempted escapes or escapes where they were actually successful. Like the fellow at upper left, man shipped as merchandise. Convict had himself put in a box by his buddies. They nailed it shut and they stenciled it, delivered to the U.S. Army Pier, Presidio, San Francisco. And he had himself shipped away, and he escaped, wasn't seen again. Under the penitentiary era, there were 14 attempts, 29 years of only 36 men. Now, 23 were caught, 6 were killed in the attempt, 2 drowned, bodies recovered, 5 were never seen again. And this is where we have to talk about the escape that changed history. These 3 guys, Frank Morris, Clarence, and John Anglin, brothers, managed to escape from inside the cell house, inside their cells, and avoid detection that they had left for more than 8 hours. It probably the most famous escape in American penal history. This rather forlorn-looking guard staring at a hole in the wall. This is where one of the 3 went out, and these are evidence photos taken by the FBI. If you'll notice, on the bed, there's a disembodied head laying there. This was probably the most brilliant part of the whole escape. These guys, each man created a papier-mâché, concrete, soap head of themselves, painted with paint to look like flesh tone, hair from the barbershop. And they would tuck this in their bed at night while they were busy tunneling their way out of the island. How they did it really quickly, they used spoons. The upper left, you broke the handle off of the spoon, threw away the bill, sharpened the end, and then you used it at lower right to gouge and like twist drill a series of holes around the air vent. This is a wannabe. This guy didn't escape, but he was trying to do the exact same thing. When you line up all those holes, those perforations, you kick the wall and the whole wall comes out. Then you build a fake section of wall out of wallboard to cover the hole. And you go out of your cell at night, and then you come back, pull the wallboard back into place. Hopefully the guards won't notice. This went on for months. When you crawled through that hole, you ended up in what's called a utility corridor on the left, where all the pipes ran, and you climbed the pipes like a jungle gym or a ladder. And at the very upper right corner, you can see it led to an air vent that led to the roof. Now, there were bars across the air vent. They sawed those out. And on the night of June 11, 1962, they removed the last bolts. They pushed the bars out. They removed the sheet metal cover, which made a tremendous noise. Guards in the guard tower heard the noise. No one thought to look on the roof to see if that's where it came from. They were searching the outside of the building. The 3 men, they ran down the length of the roof, and on the right, you're looking down, they slid down that vent pipe as at the edge of the kitchen. And at the very bottom, you'll see they landed in a pile of grease, and you see little black footprints walking away. They made it to San Francisco Bay, and they disappeared from Alcatraz and entered American mythology. They were never seen again. The manhunt went on for weeks looking for these 3 guys. And the best suspicion is, since neither Hyde nor Harriman was ever seen again, that they probably drowned and their bodies were washed out to sea. That happens frequently with people that die or commit suicide in San Francisco Bay. The Park Service, who I used to work for, the FBI gave us the evidence that they had been holding on to from the escape, and this is part of the museum collection now. A drill made out of a motor from a vacuum cleaner. There's one of the fake walls and fake vents, the paddles. The guys created what was supposed to have been a rubber life raft, and they would have going to paddle their way to Marin County. At least that's what one convict said was supposed to happen. No one knows for sure. These were left behind. And these are the holy grail of our museum collection. These are the four heads. Now, three escapees. Why four heads? The guy at upper right, he didn't go. He waited till the last minute, and he either chickened out, or by his version, he had sealed his fake wall too well, and he couldn't get out. And the others left him behind. I think he changed his mind. But that's how we know how the escape took place. His name was Alan West, and he gave his version of the escape. Of course, he was the hero. It was all his idea. These guys are wanted posters were put out. Escape from a federal penitentiary. Again, they were never seen again. There were rumors come up periodically. Oh, they made it to Central America, or they made it to Brazil, and they're sipping pina coladas down there. Pretty unlikely. If they did, there was never any solid trace of them. They never made direct contact with their families. But still, the FBI, they handed the case over to the U.S. Marshals, who still keep it open, and they put out age-enhanced images of what these guys would look like if they're still alive. They'd all be in their 90s by now, even make it even less likely they're still alive. March 21st, 1963, that was it. Yeah, only a few months after the escape, they decided Alcatraz, it is going to close. It's just not worth it. That was an embarrassment. That escape never should have happened. The prison was aging. It was also bad for public relations. Its reputation was unearnedly bleak, and the Bureau of Prisons decided to shut her down. It was actually cheaper to build a new prison in Marion, Illinois, make that the supermax, and transfer the remaining prisoners to there. This was the media circus when those last guys were marched off of Alcatraz in March '63. And the question came up, what do we do with Alcatraz? It sat there with guards, actually retired guards, now basically security guards living on the island, chasing off visitors. Well, the government decided what to do with it. Nobody wanted Alcatraz. It was expensive, it was falling apart, and different plans were floated, and then they'd drop away because they just weren't realistic. One was to build a giant statue, a counterpart to the Statue of Liberty, but in this case, a statue commemorating the founding of the UN, which was founded in San Francisco, and facing the Golden Gate. Didn't happen. This crazy idea to make it a conference center and an aerospace museum, this was gaining traction in 1969 because private money was behind it. When in the fall of 1969, a group of student activists took matters into their own hands. And this was the so-called Indian occupation. Native Americans from tribes from all over the United States flocked to Alcatraz. A handful took over the island as sort of street theater just before Thanksgiving of 1969. And they fully expected to be arrested and thrown off. They wanted publicity. Well, the government took a hands-off position. The word got out, and next thing you know, Indians are coming from all over the United States. Native Americans, a lot of Plains Indians. Many of them, the locals were students at Berkeley and San Francisco State University. And at one point, there were about 300 or 400 people living on the island, and it was it was pretty treacherous living on the island. The utilities weren't working. Water had to come. Water always came by boat. Even today, it does. And the island is. Uh, they had what they called an unthanksgiving in 1969. It was a tremendous celebration. It was a coming together of the tribes for the first time, probably since Little Bighorn, when this many tribes had worked for this goal together. And they couldn't hold it together. As time went by, they held out for 19 months. People would they'd leave the island. A rougher crew would come in. Sometimes a lot of non-Indians would come to the island. There were problems, and eventually, in 1971, when the media spotlight was elsewhere, the last 19 were removed by federal marshals. And so the question came up again: what do we do with Alcatraz? It was decided in 1972 to make it a national park site. A new national park was being created surrounding San Francisco Bay. It's called the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And they opened it for visitors for the first time in history in the fall of 1973, a little over 10 years after the prison had closed. 500,000 people came the first year, and last year before pandemic, when the visitation was at its height, it was 1.7 million annually. We can't handle any more people out there. There actually is a carrying capacity to an island. People today, when they go out, they can explore the island on their own. We use audio guided tours, which are the voices of former convicts and guards and family members. So as you go through, you hear literally from the horse's mouth, you hear about life on the island. They also offer classic ranger guided tours. They offer tours through the gardens. They offer bird watching tours. It's a huge breeding colony still for Western gulls. Volunteers do everything out there from lead guided tours and lead nature walks to actually doing hands-on restoration, replanting the gardens that we talked about during the Army days. People have always tried to make Alcatraz homey, and they did it by bringing in vegetation. And the recreation rangers gardens, they're still there. The island needs a lot of care. It might not look like it, but we recently put about $7 million into the prison building doing seismic upgrades, and it looks exactly the same. And that's good, because you don't want your restoration work to jump out at you. You want it to be subdued. You want it to be beneath or underground as much as possible within the walls of the prison. We do restoration work all over the island. Pots of money are allocated regularly for Alcatraz. In this case, the oldest building still standing on the island, the 1860s guardhouse. It was rehabilitated a few years ago, and except for a spanking new coat of paint, it looks like it did when it was first constructed in the 1850s and added in the 1860s. People sometimes come to the island and large structures are encased with plastic wrap. We do this to contain lead-based paint. Everything's coated with lead-based paint. In this case, it was the water tower that was being sandblasted and repainted. And when it was refinished, we even had the Native Americans return and repaint the graffiti that they had put on there during the Indian occupation. The occupation is now considered equally as historic as the penitentiary or the fort or the first lighthouse on the West Coast. Alcatraz's history continued up through the 1970s. And we maintain close contact with a lot of the former occupiers and their descendants. And some of them were even members of the Alcatraz Alumni Association. And before we wrap, I do have to talk about Hollywood. If you go to the International Movie Database on the internet and you type in Alcatraz, last time I did it, I got 96 films and TV shows and documentaries with Alcatraz in the title. The first one was this 1937, Alcatraz Island. Wasn't filmed on the island, of course. It was filmed on a soundstage. And it was followed by a movie called 7 Miles from Alcatraz. It doesn't even take place on the island. It takes place in a lighthouse 7 miles from Alcatraz. The movie people were learning if you put Alcatraz in the title, it's going to sell tickets. And the island developed a reputation. Penny Dreadful novels, movies. George Raft Jones at the house across the bay. She gets a house on Telegraph Hill so she can see Alcatraz where her husband is staying. The Birdman of Alcatraz. Now, these were all made while the prison was operating. None of them were made on the island. The Bureau of Prisons sure wasn't going to let Hollywood onto Alcatraz. And the Bureau of Prisons sure wasn't going to help them with their research or anything. So they sort of made up out of whole cloth a lot of things about Alcatraz. And a few years ago, it reached the point of absurdity when a movie called called The Rock with Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage came out. Totally fictitious. If you ask the staff and historians what movie got it close to being right, it was Clint Eastwood and Escape from Alcatraz. It's about the 62 escape. If you ignore some of the personality development of like the warden and some of the other characters, how the escape took place, how they carried it out, the techniques that they used, very, very accurate. Island today, still history to be learned. We're doing archaeology, we're finding underground areas. There is one true tunnel that runs through the island. We reopened it recently, so tourists can take it. It's essentially a shortcut that was carved by Army cons in the 1873, 1874 as a shortcut. It looks like something out of a Disneyland ride. This is the lower part of the citadel beneath the prison. These are the rooms that became dungeons during the Army era and during the penitentiary era, where you can still find convicts' names and numbers carved into the concrete work. Alcatraz, it's a layer cake. All you have to do, in this case, a construction crew, they broke through the floor of one of the cells. Up there, you can see where the sink is and the green walls. They broke through the concrete floor and immediately they hit brickwork. And this is the brick from the Civil War, 1850s, 1860s construction of fortifications on the island. It's, like I said, we use the term layer cake, and we're using modern technology to look through the layers of the layer cake. Ground penetrating radar shows that underneath the recreation yard, there's a whole complex of old gun emplacements. Will we ever dig them up? Don't know. We'd have to destroy one layer of history to expose another layer of history. If we can just document them in place using modern technology, science and history will be served. We opened a manhole. We didn't know what was down there one day, and it turned out it led to an underground water cistern. We found another bricked up doorway. We opened it up, and it led to a giant underground room filled with oil. It made of brick. Originally, it had been a powder magazine during the Civil War. It had been converted into a bunker oil storage tank. And it's like the underground lake in Les Miserables. It's Alcatraz keeps having secrets. It keeps being a fascinating place. It's people, it's history, it's mystique. And if you ever get to San Francisco, join me. Come out to Alcatraz. Maybe I'll be there volunteering one day.